Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today we have three guests on, or I guess if you call Darius a co-host, maybe two guests, but we've got four people on the podcast today. Myself, we've got Darius, who's a regular. We have Joey and Reginald. I'm gonna butcher that throughout this podcast. I'm gonna land on a name, but eventually I'm just gonna land on one, and we'll go with it. But thank you guys for coming on the podcast. And what I'd like to do is just give a quick introduction, who you are, what you do, real quick, and then we'll start talking about the episode.
I can go first. I'm Joey Vandergrift. I oversee our Security Operations Center. And so I lead the blue team. I just want to say, big thanks to you, Spencer and Darius. I'm a long time lurker, I guess, for first time being on the podcast. But I do listen to it myself and watch it. And I think what you guys do has been helpful, for the blue team as well. Nice. I always feel like I get some good nuggets of wisdom, when I listen and watch. So yeah.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Long time listener, first time caller. So awesome.
Yeah, and as was stated earlier, my name is Reggie Wilkerson, and I work alongside Joey in the SOC. I'm a SOC analyst at the moment. And also, like Joey, hey, every Wednesday I'm tuning in to catch up with you guys. So thank you for having me.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to it. And of course, we have Darius, who's a regular, who needs no introduction, but Darius is here as well.
Yeah, and I'm really excited that the four of us are on this call. I think it's awesome. I think we do good work. And so to be able to have, kind of both the offensive and defensive team kind of come together all in one podcast just makes me excited. So
yeah,
to be here.
Definitely. Yeah. So as we're kind of alluding to, this is an episode all about PowerShell, all about defense, blue team stuff. So we've done a number of episodes. Darren and I did an episode on kind of attacking with PowerShell and what adversaries are using PowerShell for and how and what that looks like. We did an episode on security automation with PowerShell. So a lot of DevOps stuff, scripting, automation, all that stuff. And now we're doing a defensive episode with the blue teamers, the career blue teamers who are there doing the real work to defend organizations, to stop attacks, to stop threat actors. They're doing the real hard work. So I'm excited. This is the first time we've had Joey on, first time we've had Reggie on. I think this is like the first time we've had like true defensive blue team on who are in their day-to-day as blue teamers. So I'm really excited about it as well. So yeah, this episode is how to defend and mitigate PowerShell attacks. We're going to be talking about PowerShell and all of the defenses and fun stuff that PowerShell can do for you from a defensive standpoint. So just a quick recap, PowerShell. Darius and I, if you didn't listen to the previous episodes, we have a couple episodes that I would recommend listening to. But essentially, PowerShell is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's installed by default. It's a scripting language, so it's very easy to prototype stuff. It's used for automation and all sorts of things. And it integrates very nicely with Windows, with .NET, C#. So you can download files and manipulate files and do a lot of cool stuff with PowerShell, which makes it a very attractive tool for attackers to use. So Darius, did I miss anything with PowerShell? And do we want to kind of talk about like recap of PowerShell attacks?
Sure, we can do that. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think, some of the viewers are probably tired of us talking about PowerShell, but it's an important topic. But to kind of recap, I think our attack episode, how are attackers using it? Really you see PowerShell leveraged heavily in terms of fileless malware. Same for if they're going to use some sort of C2, you're probably going to see PowerShell at some point in order for it to be able to beacon back home. And there are just tons and tons of ways of hiding your tracks because ultimately, like you said, PowerShell is everywhere. It's already integrated into pretty much Windows by default. And so that makes it easy to kind of slip and slide, your malicious payloads and PowerShell commands in with other activity.
Yeah. And Joey, before we started the episode, we were kind of talking about how we wanted to go and what we're going to talk about. You mentioned, PowerShell is not always the first thing that attackers do. Like it's not always just PowerShell runs and like all of a sudden you're infected,
Yep.
right? So what do you see from your perspective is like, how did the attacks start?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times for us, what we typically see most of the time is that it starts with a business email compromise or a phishing email. So I mean, when we look back, at some of our recent, detections that we've had over the last year, most of them, are related to a user clicking on, clicking on a malicious link or opening a malicious file that came in through a phishing email. So that still is one of the most popular attacks that threat actors use, and they can do a lot with it. They don't always use PowerShell, but eventually, like you said, it could start with like a .dat file or something like that. That can get loaded into memory, and then maybe they start using Interpreter or Cobalt Strike, and then once that gets set up, then you start to see some PowerShell commands being run. So.
Yep. Definitely. And yeah, encoded command to initiate beacons and stuff like that. And then discovery, right? Yep. Using a lot of PowerShell based tools for discovery and enumeration, reconnaissance, that kind of thing. Yep. Even lateral movement, right? With WinRM, things like that is very common as well. Yep. Reggie, is there anything else from like an attack perspective, like how it starts to, how it transitioned to, PowerShell being used here and there?
I mean, kind of piggybacking off of Joey, we typically see phishing attacks. And that's why I think it's important that we always are training users, like, don't click a link if you're not sure where the source came from. That's something that's really underrated in my eyesight. So, I mean, that's my 2 cents on that. Just making sure that the user is aware of what to be looking out for and what to pay attention to, and just to contact your IT person if you see something that's typically not what you're used to on the day-to-day.
Yeah, definitely. That's something that I would always preach in my previous job, is being the security person, IT person, is if you see something, say something. Right. If you see something, say something. Just like an empty bag in a train station or an airport, the same thing goes for like something suspicious on your computer or a program that you didn't expect we got installed, or some behavior or website. Exactly. Definitely agree.
That's a universal phrase for physical security and cybersecurity.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah. That's just overall good advice. Right. Yeah. And, so PowerShell obviously can be used for a lot of different things. It's used in a lot of different phases of an attack. But we did want to kind of pivot and talk about defenses, right? And how can firms defend against those fileless attacks? So Darius, I don't know if you want to kick it off, and then we'll kind of transition to Joey and Reggie, talk about kind of like defensive stuff, right? What are you seeing, and what do you recommend clients do from a defensive standpoint for PowerShell?
Yeah, so I guess for me, when I first think about it, is proper access controls. I think that right there is key. So like, even if someone does get popped, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of recon. We're going to see like, okay, what all do I have permissions to be able to do? And if you have proper access controls, that definitely limits some of, what can happen after the fact, even when it comes down to PowerShell.
Yeah.
If you can't get local admin on the box, that definitely reduces the risk as far as what we can do with PowerShell. So that's probably, step one. It's a big one that's really easy. It's 2023. If your users still have local admin rights on their laptops, I highly suggest making the move, getting rid of that. We've talked about it before on the podcast. There's so many solutions out there that will still, grant your end users the ability to do what they need to do, without outright giving them local admin.
Yeah. So what you're saying is local admin for all users, I shouldn't do that.
Not at all. But it still happens. I mean, we still see it on engagements. I get it. It's tough. Especially, it's really tough to try to tell, the CEO, hey, you can't be a local admin anymore. That's a tough battle to fight, but it's definitely needed.
Yeah, and it's definitely a talking point. It's definitely a maturity thing with clients, with organizations, to be able to get to that point, to get their users to trust them, to kind of help them take care of the issues that they need when they happen, right? So instead of, them trying to fix the problem themselves, they go to IT for that help. So, Joey, what are some of the like common PowerShell behaviors you see when you're responding to attacks or responding to phishing or kind of an initial triaging with PowerShell stuff? Like, what are some of the common indicators that there's some weird PowerShell stuff going on?
Yeah, so mostly for us, and Darius used to be in the SOC as well, about a year and a half ago. And he really helped us as well as far as, really start to help train our analysts on, what are the things that we really need to look for, what's going to raise a red flag, and so for us, it's usually encoded commands. If we see a hash, a hyphen encoded command in a PowerShell string, that's usually a red flag. And then you'll normally see after that, you might see some random numbers and letters, which is another indicator, that they're trying to hide something. Invoke expression, is another one. And that can just be invoke hyphen expression, I believe. And then there's also hyphen IEX. And then another one that I don't think we see quite as much, but I know if you look into it, another way to do it is a dot ampersand. And so, all of those things, we've really tried to educate our analysts, like, hey, if we see these things, we need to quarantine that machine, immediately or isolate it from the network, dig into it a little deeper. Another thing that we see outside of that is, again, going back to it being encoded, a lot of times it's encoded with base 64. I think base 64 is, the most popular obfuscation, encoding that we see. And usually our analysts will go into CyberChef or something like that, to hopefully allow them to see, what is that script actually trying to do. I know recently we saw one where I believe it was encoded like 3 times, 3 layers deep, and that took a little bit, so that's why we always say isolate first, then go in, do some digging and see if we can really determine what's going on. Because it's not always obvious right away, right? So, but we do, you can tell though, hey, if it's using encoding, a normal IT guy or girl is not going to be, using encoding PowerShell commands most of the time, right? I mean, you're usually trying to hide something if you're going to that level. So
yeah, and it's funny because I see, some tools, IT tools, security tools that will use encoded command periodically here and there and stuff like that. But that stuff, you can kind of rule out in terms of, understanding what that is, knowing it, and kind of ruling that out and excluding it. But Reggie, have you seen any crazy, like obfuscated, like PowerShell stuff? Like Joey, you mentioned like 3 layers deep obfuscation, right? There could be, I've seen on Twitter, like people posting these crazy obfuscated PowerShell commands. Like, what's the craziest you've seen so far?
I mean, probably like Joey, sometimes we get double encoded, triple encoded, it just depends. I typically look for threat actors normally use like quotations and the plus symbol to try to break up their words with their payloads. So I try to look for that. So just things like that. Nothing too crazy, but that's typically what I see on the day-to-day.
Yeah. It's like those dolls that have like the doll inside, or the little toy. What are those? Like the Russian toy dolls? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I forget what they're called.
The Russian nesting dolls.
Yeah, they're like the doll inside the doll, and then it's like this whole thing that you just take apart, and it's like sometimes I feel like the double, triple, quadruple encoded stuff and like overly obfuscated stuff is like that.
Right. True.
I think Reggie, brings up a good point. Something that I think like threat actors, they get really creative. I remember one time, seeing an alert, and it was like they were like pulling the string of like a file or something like that, and then they would get the substring to only pull one character, and it's just a whole huge thing of pulling all these letters from various places just to like spell out IEX or something. Like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Trying to bypass the antivirus and EDR solutions. It's crazy what they go through just to get to the point.
Yeah. Well, and I think PowerShell ignores extra white space as well, right? So I think sometimes you'll see that too,
Yep.
just a lot of extra white space that just kind of extends it out. And so
Yep.
they definitely have to get creative to try to avoid detection.
Yep, I've definitely used some of those techniques too for like AMZ bypasses or like obfuscating scripts before. So I definitely, it definitely resonates with me from the other side of the coin.
Yep.
And I think, from a defensive standpoint, I think it makes sense to, when we're talking about defensive mitigations for PowerShell, some of the things that come to mind are like eliminating PowerShell v2, right?
Yep.
PowerShell v2 doesn't have logging. It doesn't have the same controls around it, although your EDR is injecting into that PowerShell process, so it's still going to be able to detect certain malicious things. So that's not as big of a problem anymore, but that increases the attack surface, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Anything you can do to reduce your attack surface always helps. So.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
And Darius, you already mentioned kind of local admin privs. Logging and monitoring, I think, is something that his EDR has done a better and better job of over the years. Previously, just a few years ago, it seemed like, the PowerShell logging capabilities that EDR products had wasn't as up to snuff as where it should be. But we do a lot of purple teams, and just in a recent purple team we did, I was surprised to see how well it was doing at capturing the PowerShell-based activity on the endpoint. Now, there's ways to obfuscate it. There's ways to hide it. There's ways to disable the logging and stuff like that. So, it might be a good idea, depending on your security stack and how you have things configured, to back up those script block logs. And what I mean is like have a backup solution. So maybe use Windows Event Forwarding to forward those logs to the SIM or to something like that. So you have the Windows Event logs, so in the PowerShell script block logs, module logging, sending to your SIM, and then you also have what the EDR is able to capture with the command line arguments and all of the memory and all that stuff that the EDR is able to have, just so you have a backup. Because we obviously don't want to rely on EDR alone, right, as a single point of failure. What else? Reggie or Joey, feel free to jump in. Like, what else are you guys thinking of in terms of, like, how do we defend against PowerShell-based attacks?
I mean, I think in terms of additionally, as far as just not only detection and trying to log what you can, but also, there's other ways to, like you said, try to eliminate older versions of PowerShell. Maybe try to standardize on a certain version if you can, and only allow that. Using the least privilege principle, like we talked about, and I think, I don't know a ton about some of these, but I was reading up this week, in preparation for this podcast. One of the things I came across was something called just enough administration. I don't know if you guys have heard of that recently, but I think that's something that Microsoft is now offering, so that IT admins can kind of take advantage of kind of a built-in framework to only give, I guess, certain roles or certain IT users, specific admin rights.
Yeah.
And then you've also got the PowerShell constrained language mode as well, right? So that can kind of reduce some of that as well. So there's a lot you can do. I mean, you can also disable PowerShell using group policy, right? If you've got a whole bunch of workstations, maybe or endpoints that just don't have a need to run PowerShell, and maybe you're not using it, for certain administrative tasks, then maybe consider blocking it everywhere and only allowing it, on certain servers or things like that. So.
Yeah, the two big things that I always recommend, during pen tests when I'm using PowerShell and I notice that it's not heavily restricted, is constrained language mode. So limiting what, commandlets are available, getting rid of PowerShell v2, and application control. So only allowing, certain users or certain groups to execute PowerShell, on the endpoints. Now, all of those things can be bypassed. All of those things can have their ways to get around them, but those create additional noise, right? Now you are able to monitor for those outliers or the behaviors that generate noise outside of the normal, bypass itself, or the normal usage itself. So it makes attackers have to work a little bit harder, makes them have to make a little bit more noise. And those things are really good. The other one that I think is really important too is kind of taken for granted a little bit in environments is WinRM.
Yep.
Right? WinRM is enabled by default on servers, not on workstations. But if an attacker gets privileged credentials, they can use WinRM to kind of move laterally.
Yep.
And you can firewall that, you can restrict it, but that's also a good way to kind of mitigate some of the lateral movement capabilities that are inherent in PowerShell.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, one of the things we do, if we're helping a client through an IR or an incident to where maybe PowerShell, is being used to move laterally and things like that, we put a block on WinRM and PowerShell using the EDR tool in environments where maybe they didn't have these additional layers of protection in place already. So that's just a quick way that we can help, slow the threat actor down, try to contain it and eradicate it. But it's definitely one of the things that we mentioned as a lesson learned on the other side of that is, try to put in these additional layers of protection. And we always preach in cybersecurity, right? The more layers of defense you have, the better. So, yeah.
Yeah. And Darius, Joey, you mentioned just-in-time administration. I, was wondering that too. And I'm curious, I've never used it personally. I've heard of it. Darius, I don't know if you have any experience using it, but I haven't seen it. So like on pen test engagements, I haven't seen clients using it. So I don't know how popular it is or how effective it is. But Darius, I don't know if you've seen it anywhere.
No, actually, I haven't. I think the closest, and truth be told, I'll probably have to read up on it a little bit more. But when I think of the closest thing I can think of in just-in-time administration is something like Make Me Admin or one of those tools where you don't have local admin rights, and then you have to then put in a request. It's kind of similar, to it's a PIM solution, right? And so where you temporarily get elevated, you do what you need to do, and then you drop back down. That's the closest that I can think of.
Yep.
And I imagine that's kind of what what Microsoft is trying to shift towards.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you could make parallels with Azure IDs or Entra IDs, privileged identity management now too, and kind of that tool suite for limited, time limited, host limited permissions or access privileges. The other thing I think is interesting too, just from a defensive PowerShell standpoint, is PowerShell ISE and the PowerShell history logs. So there is a wealth of information in those history files. If you're able to capture those history files, if those history files are not overwritten or modified, those can be a good source of information too. So both ISE and PowerShell.exe have history files. ISE's is a little bit different. It's tied to it's in a different location, and it just behaves a little bit differently than the PowerShell history logs. But both of those can be very valuable. And I think by default with PowerShell ISE, when you open it up, it will save the contents of your script every 2 minutes. And you can modify that in the profile and stuff like that. But if a threat actor is just opening up PowerShell ISE, maybe they have GUI access, right, to the host, and they're running commands, you might be able to grab those ISE save files and analyze those and do forensics on them and stuff like that. So that's also kind of a source of information for defenders, for IR folks, forensics folks to kind of inspect what's going on that endpoint.
And now that you say that, that's a good point of, is it possible to just block ISE? I imagine most end users aren't really using, aren't going to be
actually. So on a recent engagement, in a recent internal pen test, I actually saw on the endpoint that I was on, the client gave us access to, they had uninstalled PowerShell ISE. So they didn't even have it installed. Now, you can still bring the .NET libraries needed for PowerShell to the host and still use PowerShell without the PowerShell binary being there. But again, additional hoops that the attackers have to jump through, makes more noise. There's different things to alert on. So you can restrict it and disable it, uninstall it, all that stuff. And that might be a good strategy for some of your endpoints or for some groups of users that you have for sure.
Nice. That's cool.
So Darius, Joey, Reggie, what else? Is there anything else we missed from a defensive standpoint, or anything else we didn't talk about from a defensive PowerShell?
Yeah, I think we missed the most basic one, actually. Execution policies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, I think making it so that, hey, at the bare minimum, only trusted signed scripts.
That's right. Yeah.
Can run. I think that's one that, easy to implement. Can it be bypassed? Yes, but
it makes it harder.
Yeah, defense in depth.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one because most commonly on pen tests, so it varies. On pen tests, I am sometimes downloading scripts just for convenience and running them. So execution policy gets in the way there. A lot of times attackers are just running them in line, so they don't necessarily need to worry about execution policy if they're like running IEX and downloaded the script in memory. They don't have to necessarily worry about it, but it does. So if you are going to use, where I will say it's valuable, right, from a defensive standpoint, or one of the areas is if you are using PowerShell scripts in your environment, signing those scripts and setting the execution policy to signed, and then creating your own code signing certificate and signing all of your PowerShell scripts with that code signing certificate. That way, if an attacker gets a hold of, if they get access to a file share, right, and they see a script that's being run, they can't just manipulate the file, save it, and let it run. It will break it'll break the certificate, right? In the PowerShell script, right? So the integrity checking will fail, right, on the script. So that I think is an important caveat to that is like if you're going to use PowerShell scripts, sign them so then they can't be abused, or there's a less chance they'll be abused.
Yep. Yeah, I also think too, just going back to basics, regular patching and updates, right? If you keep your systems patched, you kind of help prevent, known vulnerabilities, that might be exploited via PowerShell. And then network segmentation, I think that's another big one too, just trying to segment your network so that if a threat actor did get access to one segment, they're not getting access to all of it. So again, those are just, everybody always says, these are the basic things that you need to do, and a lot of people want to throw, fancy tools and products at it. But, a lot of times it's some of the basic stuff, like some of what we've already been talking about. So
it's the blocking and tackling, right?
Yep.
For sure. Cool. Well, I think that's it. I think that's all we've got for today. We hope you guys listening enjoyed it. If you're watching on YouTube, we'd love if you would subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're listening to the podcast in audio form, if you want to follow the show, like it, subscribe, leave a comment, let us know what you think. We'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, if you got value, consider sharing it with your peers, with your network. That would be awesome. You can check us out at offsec.blog. We're posting a lot of our blogs and content and a lot of awesome stuff there. And you can also check us out at secureIT360.com. And we will see you next Wednesday.